The French invaders. Today's guest on French Invaders is Thomas Fazi, one of the sharpest journalists around, reporting on and analyzing European affairs. Thomas writes for Unheard, compact magazine, as well as on his own Substack. He has authored several books. You'll find the details below. Since we'll be discussing today the European Union, we feel that a short reminder of what the European Union is, and most importantly, what it is not, may be useful. The European Union is not a sovereign state, but an intergovernmental organization gathering, as per today, 27 sovereign states operating a single market where people, goods and services flow freely. In order to do so, these 27 member states are implementing common policies leading to common laws and regulations which are being enforced throughout the single market. Some even went further than that and created a single currency, the euro. As per today, 20 states have adopted the euro as their currency. Supranational institutions were created to manage all that. The European Council is the decision-making body of the EU. It comprises heads of states and heads of government of all member states. Again, the EU is intergovernmental in essence. Then you have the European Commission, which is the European bureaucracy. It has no decision-making power per se. Its role is to propose EU legislation and ensure that once it is adopted, it is enforced throughout the EU. This is why Ursula von der Leyen is not the president of the EU. She's the contract civil servant that heads the European Commission. The European Parliament is a makeshift parliament. It exists for the sole purpose of providing a flavor of democracy. The people of each member state elects its representative to the European Parliament that has no decision-making power, but a blocking one on a number of issues. The Eurogroup is the informal and monthly meeting of finance ministers of all states participating into the euro, but yet it does not set monetary policy, which is the sole prerogative of the European Central Bank. Now you're thinking it sounds like, mind our French, a clusterfuck? You may be right. Thomas Fazi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We would like first to get your take on the actual track record of the EU. Is it a catastrophe on every single issue, or can it be redeemed?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. It's a real pleasure. So the short answer to your question is yes. I would say it has been an unmitigated disaster. Look, I mean, before getting bogged down on the details, we can look at every single aspect of EU policy over the past 30 years. But I think we have to take a wide-angle look at the issue. And I think if we look at what the European Union had promised, what was the fundamental premise of the EU's supranational project? It was that we live in an increasingly complex world, an increasingly interconnected, internationalized world. And in this world, individual nation states are simply incapable of asserting their sovereignty, their economic sovereignty. So this sovereignty that they claim to have is already rendered meaningless by globalization. This, according to the supranationalist narrative that we've been hearing for the past to go for Europe, would be to pool all these different sovereignties together, to centralize them at the European level, and that this would make European countries and Europe as a whole stronger, more resilient, more dynamic, more competitive. It would make them stronger, not just economically, but geopolitically. This was one of the driving arguments in favor of European supranationalization, of European integration, of the European Union itself, and especially of its main economic pillar, which is the single currency, the euro. 30 years down the road, can we say that the European Union has delivered on its promise? Clearly not. Today, the European Union is facing economic stagnation, if not deindustrialization, for a number of its states, including its now former, I would say, industrial powerhouse, Germany. As the Draghi report recently highlighted, the EU is less competitive, less dynamic, is falling behind other advanced economies, not just China, but also a comparable Western economy, such as the United States. But not just that. The European Union, the single currency, has also increased economic disparities within the European Union. On top of this, it has also made the European Union, Europe, geopolitically irrelevant. Everyone can see that now Europe is, geopolitically non-existent on the world stage. It's essentially seen as an extended arm of the US and of NATO. So Europe is more vassalized than it's ever been since 1945. On top of that, we know just how much the European Union and the single currency have corroded the democratic well-being of European nations, of European societies. So, overall, I think there's no doubt that the European Union has been a complete failure. Failure is maybe the wrong term, in a sense that I would argue that a lot of these outcomes were seen as an acceptable price to pay by the European elites in exchange for gaining more power vis-a-vis the people, vis-a-vis citizens. I would define the EU as the main political rationale for the European Union as that of essentially, hollowing out democracy in Europe, of insulating the decision-making process from democracy, from democratic pressure, by transferring most of the decision-making process from the national level, where people can hope to exercise some control, to the supranational level. In this respect, the project has been a huge success. So maybe talking of failure is not entirely correct, but I think it has definitely been a failure by its own, based on its own goals, based on its own stated goals, which were of making Europe stronger, more resilient economically and geopolitically. What we have today is the exact opposite of this. And I would just conclude by saying that, contrary to what some die-hard Europeanists are still trying to argue, and that is that all this is the result of the fact that we haven't had enough integration, and that the solution consists in, quote unquote, more Europe. It's pretty clear that this is, in fact, the result of the supranational integration model itself. So I think, I don't think these problems can be solved within the EU's supranational paradigm, because they are a consequence of supranationalism itself. This, unique experiment at the global level, no one else went down this road, or is even thinking 30 years later of going down that road. In fact, wherever we look, we see countries engage in completely different forms of cooperation, international forms of cooperation, not supranational forms of cooperation, which are delivering much better results. So it's So I mean, it's clear to me that this is a failure of supranationalism itself as a viable model of governance. It's clear that it's failed on an economic, on a political, on a geopolitical, and also, but just as importantly, on a democratic representative level. So from my standpoint, it's been a complete failure, yes.
Thomas, thank you so much for this great explanation of the record track of failure of the European Union. There is one specific aspect which I think is particularly interesting in your report, which I'd like to actually remind the title for our listeners: the silent coup, the European Commission's power grab. It's the role played by what you call the perma crisis in the shaping and the competence creep by particularly the European Commission, and how that perma crisis was in fact, integrated from the very founding of the European Union in the architecture of the European Union, even if we go back to Monet and Schuman. If you could develop a bit on this, yeah.
Yes. I'll try to sum up a very long, complex story. But if we go back to the theories of the early fathers of European integration, people like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, that you just mentioned, I think it's pretty clear that what they were aiming for was a kind of European super state. One that would, slowly dissolve national sovereignties, which were seen, even in good faith. From in a lot of the in the eyes of a lot of people of the post-war generation, as something that was intrinsically bad, as something that intrinsically leads to war, intrinsically leads to conflict. They had, I would say, even their good faith reasons, even though they were completely flawed in my analysis, but they had their good faith reasons for wanting to overcome nation states. But it's pretty clear that that's what they were aiming for. They wanted to overcome the nation state as the main kind of organizing political system in Europe for a new, completely untested and unprecedented system, i.e. a supranational system of governance. But at the same time, they were perfectly aware that, especially in the early post-war years, let's remember that sort of the founding principles of the post-war system were very much based on national sovereignty. What we built in the aftermath of World War II was largely a nation state based international system. Not just the UN, but every other international institution that we built. It was very much a system that was premised on the almost the sacredness of national sovereignty, and that's what gave a big thrust to the various decolonization movements. All of that was founded in this principle of national sovereignty as the founding principle of the international, as a sort of basic principle of the international system. So, of course, even more so at that time, there was no, there wasn't a cultural context that would have been favorable to the construction of this supranational superstate. So they devised what has been called a small steps doctrine, and the idea is that you have to begin by creating forms of international cooperation between European states on very specific issues, very practical issues that may not seem like a big issue, but and of course the European steel and coal community and other early forms of international and even supranational cooperation were good examples of this. But they were perfectly aware that even small steps in this supranational along this supranational trajectory would create conditions, would create pressures for further integration down the road. And they especially understood that this kind of path dependency would be further exacerbated by crises. So they understood that crises would become kind of facilitating events that would drive governments to accept sort of increased levels of power by the supranational institutions of the European Union. And in fact, this is exactly what has happened, especially over the past 15 years, throughout the various crises that have rocked the European Union, all the way from the euro crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, through the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, and now the Ukraine crisis. What we've seen is a very clear pattern emerge where the the supranational institutions of the European Union. So first and foremost, the European Commission, but also the European Central Bank, and I would also add in the European Court of Justice, have exploited each and every one of these crises to surreptitiously expand, to surreptitiously broaden the scope of their power, slowly extending their control over areas of policy making that were not given to them by the European treaties, which are not foreseen by the European treaties. And in fact, a lot of these sort of very profound institutional changes have happened outside the realm of the treaties, outside the realm of European law. Even they've definitely happened outside the realm of democratic debate. And what we've seen as a result of this is that today, the European Commission, which is a largely unaccountable, undemocratic, unelected institution, exercises a huge power in, I would say, every area of policy making in the European Union today. Not just regulation, which is what people tend to focus on, this sort of hyper-regulatory drive of the European Commission where, the size of the bananas debate and all that, but much more dramatically, it today exercises vast controls in areas of, economic policy making. And now, following especially the Ukraine war, it also has transformed into basically an institution that decides and has large control over the foreign and even security and military policy of the European Union. And this is an area where it formally has no jurisdiction based on the European treaties. So really what we've seen is, in my paper, I call this a silent coup because a lot of this has happened really behind the scenes, and it's happened, without a lot of people even realizing that this was going on behind the scenes. But this is where we are now, and I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation because the European Union and especially the single currency already presented very, very serious democratic deficits to begin with. I mean, the simple fact of giving a supranational institution such as the European Central Bank control over your currency effectively already makes you into a colony. Because the currency is the fundamental basis of economic sovereignty, and so if you don't control your currency, you pretty much don't control your economic policy. It means that you've ceded control of your economic policy to a supranational institution which you don't control. So there were already very, very fundamental problems to start with, but now we see that these problems have been deepened beyond our wildest fears. Because yes, now, as I said, we see someone like Ursula von der Leyen essentially acting as the commander-in-chief of the European Union, pushing us down a very, very dangerous road of military confrontation with Russia. And essentially, and again, it relates to what I was saying earlier. I mean, this would be bad enough if Mrs. von der Leyen were at least pursuing some degree of strategic autonomy, so to speak, for the European Union. So it would be still problematic from a democratic standpoint, but at least it would be acceptable from a wider kind of geopolitical standpoint. Well, yes, she's acting like a dictator, but at least she's an enlightened dictator that's clearly acting in Europe's best interest. But this is clearly not what is happening. What we see today, as I said earlier, is von der Leyen essentially acting, I would say, as an American agent, someone who sees it as its job to ensure that Europe remains, through the European Union, subordinated to the broader US-driven, US-led, transatlantic system and transatlantic geostrategic imperatives. Even though this clearly goes against Europe's basic economic, strategic, and geopolitical interests, and so. This is where we're at now today. So I think we're in a very, very dangerous stage the evolution of the European Union.
Okay, so but this competency creep is fundamentally illegal. It is not grounded in the treaties, as you mentioned. Don't you think that we are going to see some kind of a blowback, which, as a matter of fact, has already started? I mean by that the European institutions and mainly the European Commission will be put back in place or possibly even stripped from some of their prerogatives.
Well, we're not seeing that happening for now. I think it's really important to understand like why. Because of course, a fundamental comeback that I always get when I make this argument from pro Europeanists is, well, but every single step of this process has been rubber stamped by member states, and so you can't say it was surreptitious. It was at every stage of this process, the member states, the European Council green-lighted this, and this is not entirely true, but it is largely true. And of course, when I say it's not entirely true, is because this form of competence creep, for example, happens also in the legal arena through the rulings of the European Court of Justice. So the European Court of Justice has repeatedly kind of ruled in favor of supranationalization, in favor of the primacy of European law over national law. And so here you have a clear example of how you can further supranationalize the policymaking process in the European Union without the member states having any say whatsoever. But if we focus, solely on the European Commission, it is true that a lot of the decisions and a lot of the processes that have been driven forward by the European Commission have at some point been rubber stamped by the European Council. But it's important to understand, why member states have felt compelled to do this. And I think it's important to understand that one of the effects of supranationalization is precisely, and this relates to the kind of, the functionalist theories, which have proven completely true of the early founding fathers. And that is that if you slowly strip, member states of national sovereignty, they will find themselves increasingly incapable of facing external crises, external shocks, because they've been stripped of the tools that are needed to do that. And so even though they might not ideologically favor handing over more power to the European Commission, they find themselves in a way compelled to do so because, they're lacking the tools to respond to these crises. And, the Euro crisis, even the Ukraine crisis are clear examples of this. So this is one issue, and I think this explains why, at the end of the day, member states have, including governments that we would not consider, ideologically favorable to further supranationalization, ultimately end up lending their support to this process. So this is one issue. Another issue is that we have, unfortunately, one of the side effects of supranationalization is that you end up with an increasingly fecal political class. You end up with a political class that, precisely because it has delegated all the major policy-making decisions on some of the most fundamental aspects of politics, i.e., economic policy and foreign policy, having delegated economic policy to the European Union and foreign policy largely to NATO, what you end up with is an increasingly infantilized and increasingly really poor quality political class, which lacks the political, the intellectual tools to engage in high stake politics. And so that creates a reinforcing trend where these people, they don't want to be, they revel in supranationalism because it means that they can pretend to be very powerful when in fact they're simply delegating all these decisions to these supranational institutions and are then subsequently rewarded for doing a good job while in power at within their nation states. So all they have to do is go along with the diktats, go along with the orders that come from Frankfurt, from Brussels, from Washington, and they know that they will be rewarded once they get out of office. So what we've had is seriously a very, very profound erosion of true policymaking, of true politicians in Europe. And I think if we look around the European landscape today, we, among the our so-called European leaders, there are very, very few that I think any of us would call actual statesmen, actual leaders. I can think of maybe one or two. I can think of, whether one agrees with his policies or not, Orban is clearly a statesman. He's clearly kind of an old school politician who tries to act in what he considers to be his country's national interest. But there are very few other politicians around Europe for which that can be said. So that's another problem, which kind of explains this process. And then we should never forget that it's very hard to challenge the European Union from within precisely because of the control that the European Union exercises over these elected governments. And I come from Italy. And so my country has several examples over the course of the past 10, 15 years, whereby the European Union has directly intervened into the affairs of our country and has directly resorted to forms of financial and monetary blackmail or monetary pressure through the ECB to, get our elected governments to sort of go along with the EU agenda. So when you look at someone like Meloni today in Italy, even assuming that she, that she truly believes, in the criticism of the European Union that she's put out through the years before becoming prime minister, even assuming that she truly wanted to try to oppose these policies, it's very clear, she understands better than anyone else, that she cannot go up against these policies because she will be made to pay a price if she dares to challenge too radically the EU agenda, which today is also the EU-NATO agenda. So this makes challenging the European Union from within very, very hard. So you're saying, at some point, these more and more governments will start to challenge the European Commission, the growing powers of the European Commission. Yes, but how do they do that while safeguarding themselves from retaliation by the institutions of the European Union, by the European Commission, by the European Central Bank? I think one of the reasons that Orban has been able to get away with, straying from the line on both, EU policy as well as NATO policy for so long is precisely because Hungary is not in the euro. And so Hungary has a much bigger degree of economic autonomy than it would have if it had joined the euro, and it's a very good thing it didn't. So to conclude more in general, I think we forget that reforming the European Union to create what? I return to what I was saying earlier. There are fundamental problems in the concept of a supranational form of governance itself, for the simple fact that you can't completely harmonize the interests of 30 states, which have very heterogeneous economic models, economic priorities, economic aspirations, but even value systems, even cultural systems, different outlooks on the world, and nowadays very different geopolitical priorities as well. So that's why even among the so-called Eurosceptic populists, we see that there are there's a lot of differences on central issues, especially of foreign policy. So I think ultimately, there's no way of reforming the European Union, and there's no way of making it kind of an actual state, a la USA, which is what for what federalists have been daydreaming of for a very long time. The preconditions for that simply aren't there. And so I think ultimately we might witness some pushback. We might witness even some rollback in the powers of the European Commission, even though so far, as even the recent European elections have shown, despite a greater number of so-called right populist parties coming into the European Parliament, we haven't seen that translate into much of a change. In fact, we still have von der Leyen with an even worse commission in power than the first one. And so I think we have to really acknowledge that fundamentally, I think there's no way of truly, reforming in a truly regenerational sense, the European Union. I think whatever we do, we will remain stuck in this limbo where member states have lost a lot of their sovereignty, but this sovereignty has not been, this hasn't been compensated by the creation of an actual state at the European level. In this, the federalists are right. What they don't say is that this problem isn't solvable because the European Union simply cannot evolve into a state, even assuming this is a desirable outcome, which I wouldn't consider it to be desirable, but it's more fundamentally an impossible outcome. So we're stuck in this limbo, and I don't think we're going to get out of it anytime soon.
But Thomas, just a question about the role, maybe the personality of Ursula von der Leyen is playing on this process. From what I understand, when she was appointed, she was quite an threatening character for people like Macron, who want to aspire to actually become the heads of a EU superstate, a European superstate. But it looks to me that, in fact, she has managed to become somewhat kind of a Stalin compared to Trotsky for the European Union, or is kind of like a kind of a girl boss Stalin for the European Union. And I just wanted to get your opinion on the role that her personality plays on this competence creep and this kind of supranationalization of the European Union.
If I may just barge in, we need to keep in mind also that von der Leyen name was whispered by the Americans in Macron's ear. Mm-hmm. Because keep in mind that was that Timmermans who was foreseen as becoming the head of the EC, could not be, and then there was limbo too. So it's a bit should be taken into account.
I think von der Leyen's ties with Washington are a very important aspect of what has happened over the past 4 years. And I think it very much relates to, again, why we haven't seen the European Union become what we had promised it would become, i.e. a counterbalance to American power. I think especially on the left, this has always been one of the founding kind of idealistic arguments in favor of the European Union. So we've also seen on the left this kind of almost pro independentist, even anti-American kind of take on why we need the European Union. But I think this was always based on a very flawed premise, and I think it's enough to go back to World War II and see the way in which the Americans have always supported the move towards the Europeanization and the supranationalization and the federalization of European politics. We know the CIA was funding a lot of the pro-European federalist movements in the early post-war years, and I think that's because they understood, to the extent that after the war they saw Europe as essentially a region of the American empire to be subject to American control. I think they realized that having a centralized system of governance over which they always understood that they would have had extensive control, because of the sort of kind of system of control over Europe that they put in place after World War II, which which expresses itself through forms of ideological, cultural control, but also very material control in terms of the very deep connections that we know exist between the American security state and the European security states and deep states, etc., etc. They always understood that having a central government exercising a large control over Europe would have been very convenient for them. And I think, fast forward 30 years to von der Leyen, we can see that project, playing out very, 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 very clearly. And so you're right to point out that von der Leyen, that the Americans, I think, very clearly played a role in selecting von der Leyen. And once again, I think the European governments, and especially the French, which have a tendency to do that, have been bamboozled by the European Union. I think the French have been, I would say, repeatedly kind of bamboozled, all the way from them joining from them very much driving forward the creation of the single currency and expecting that to act as a straitjacket on Germany, all the way to a whole set of other decisions. But I think it's pretty clear that they weren't expecting von der Leyen to play a role such as the one that she has played. So, and I think you can almost justify them for it because she didn't have a great track record. She seemed like a bit of a bit of a lame duck, just someone who had collected various scandals and was seen as a pretty incompetent person, during her role as German minister. And I think they probably thought, and honestly, she doesn't come across as being a particularly charismatic, profound or even smart person, to be honest. At least that's just my personal impression. So that might have played a role in the sense of them, of member states, first and foremost, Macron, thinking that maybe she wouldn't be so much of a threat. But clearly, I think she has proven to be extremely skilled at using at having a deep understanding and at using very well this very complex multi-level governance system that is the European Union to her advantage, but more in general, I would say, to the advantage of this process of supranationalization, more in general. And she did it for the first 4 years of her first mandate, and I think she was also very clever in outmaneuvering all the or a lot of the member states also in the process leading up to the creation of the second commission. I think the way she managed to get rid of Thierry Breton, who was a very powerful French commissioner, replacing him with someone whose name no one can even remember, and who yes, exactly. But I was really also trying to make. I think again proves that once Macron was kind of outmaneuvered, I think once more in accepting this trade-in. But also I think we should never forget that at the same time, I think it pitting simply understanding what's going on as a dichotomic relationship between the European Commission on one hand and the member states on another, I think would be a mistake, because one of the reasons that member states have aided this process of supranationalization is because historically, going all the way back to the founding of the European Union, especially the single currency, they saw it as a way of increasing their own powers. So this process of depoliticization, transferring more and more powers to the European Union, on the face of it, might appear completely self-defeating for national elites. Why would they choose to willfully transfer national prerogatives to the European Union, thereby diminishing their own power? Because they understood, and again, I think they were proven right in this, that by doing this, they would be increasingly able to scapegoat the European Union for policies that they themselves wanted to implement in the first place. So they viewed, I think, the European Union and especially the euro as a kind of Trojan horse to implement unpopular policies by saying, look, dear people, we don't want to implement these policies. We're very much against them, but we're forced to do it because now we're part of this multinational club and we have to go along with what the European Commission and the European Central Bank and every other member state is doing. And I think And I think this is proving true, still proves true today. And I would say even more so at a time when sort of mainstream national elites, and Macron is obviously a paradigmatic example of that, feel very much threatened by their growing lack of consensus, legitimacy, public support. They feel very much threatened by these new populist forces that are rising across Europe, challenging, centrist, pro-status quo politicians like Macron. And in this context, I think national politicians, or at least mainstream establishment national politicians, very much view the European Union as an ally against these populist forces. And I think it's very clear, if we look at the recent French elections, I think it's very clear the way both Macron and the EU institutions kind of weaponized this very small rise in interest rates, which the European Central Bank could have put a stop to very easily just with a click on a computer keyboard, but didn't, because this is how the European Union works. By allowing the financial markets to apply pressure to governments, these apparently neutral institutions, and by allowing them to do that, I mean by not intervening to stop that, which is something the European Central Bank could do, you can, to a large degree, really influence, public opinion. And I think we very clearly saw it in the recent French elections, the way that, both the European institutions, people in the European Commission, but also Macron said, oh, look at, this is what will happen if Le Pen wins. We will have this big financial crisis. And Macron was very much aided in this, both from a practical standpoint, but also from a narrative standpoint, by the European Union. And I think that also explains why at the end of the day, even politicians, I think that goes for most politicians, most national politicians don't like von der Leyen, but they see her as an unavoidable ally in this historical phase in their struggle against populism, but ultimately in their struggle against democracy.
Don't you think, Thomas, that she will face a considerable hurdle anyway with the recent re-election of Donald Trump, having been installed precisely by the political opposition to Trump, and now that Trump has in his team people like Elon Musk and people like Tulsi Gabbard or Vivek Ramaswamy, who are, complete game changer in terms of geopolitical relationship, particularly with Russia and to a lesser extent with China. It's like, how do you view that competence creep and the imperial presidency of Ursula von der Leyen in the context of the re-election of Trump?
Look, honestly, I have a very hard time trying to make predictions about what to expect from the future Trump presidency, because, well, on the one hand, you have Trump himself, who is a completely unpredictable person. So it's really very hard to make predictions. I think, yes, you mentioned the kind of more hopeful picks that he made in terms of foreign policy, Gabbard, and even J.D. Vance, and of course, especially when it comes to Russia, they provide some hope of lending support to Trump's at least stated aim of bringing this war to an end. But I think when we look at a lot of other people that he's staffed, in his cabinet in terms of foreign policy and national security, we see a lot of people that I would personally define as neocons, or at least primicists, people that still subscribe to the notion that America has a God-given right to control and govern the world. And I think ultimately even Trump himself subscribes to this worldview. So as much as I think there are positive elements in Trump's re-election, especially potentially for Europe. At the same time, let's wait and see, because I don't see Trump as really being that fundamental paradigm change that would be necessary for America to kind of evolve from this declining imperial power to just a normal country, a normal, powerful country, among others, capable of engaging with the world on a a normal basis of respect for the sovereignty of other countries, etc. And honestly, I think I wouldn't hold my hopes up too much about what to expect from a Trump presidency. But when it comes to Europe, honestly, it's even harder to gauge what's going to happen. Honestly, I don't know, because I mean, what we have here is a situation where Trump does seem, pretty serious about bringing this war to an end. But I think he will face a lot of pushback from the pro-war establishment in America, even within his own party. Not to mention the fact that Russia is going to push for a very hard bargain, I think, which even Trump himself might have a hard time accepting. But then we have the fundamental fact that I think the European establishment has internalized, I think, America's worldview, America's geostrategic interests, and what they perceive to be as the interests of the transatlantic relationship, or in the way they were defined under Biden, then I think they will have a very hard time adapting to this presidency. And unfortunately, I think they won't see it as an opportunity to finally wind down this war. I fear that they might, in fact, view it as an excuse to ramp up support for Ukraine and ramp up their support for the proxy war in Ukraine. So, and I think again, von der Leyen might play quite an important role in that respect. And also, let's not forget that ultimately, I don't think Trump wants Europe to become strategically autonomous. I think precisely because he still subscribes to that primacist worldview, he still views Europe as a continent, as a geopolitical entity that ultimately has to move in lockstep with what the U.S. considers to be its own interests, and so it doesn't want geopolitical autonomy. And ultimately, I think it might be more than happy for to lend its support to the further militarization of the European Union under the guise of strategic autonomy, but in fact simply maintaining Europe as a subordinate actor within sort of America's wider geopolitical strategy, while sort of picking up a much bigger share of the tab for it. So I think I think Trump more than anything wants Europe to pay more for its defense, and I think von der Leyen would be more than happy to oblige that. And so I think we might see a way in which they actually sort of converge on this issue of making Europe less militarily and financially dependent on America, but just as geopolitically subordinate as it was under Biden. What that means for Russia, honestly, it's very hard to tell. And more than anything, I'm concerned about surviving the next 2 months before Trump gets into the White House.
Maybe a transition, Thomas, to another book that you have authored, which is, I think, I really recommend it to everybody, with Toby Green, the COVID consensus that has been, I think it's the greatest reference material for the whole COVID crisis. I was plunged in it in the past 10 days, and it's like, it really clarifies that whole fog in which one finds himself when facing that horrible sequence of history that happened with the COVID, and so it's called The COVID Consensus: The Global Assault on Democracy and the Poor, a critique from the left. I think it is the best text on the COVID with Paul King's North, the vaccine moment, for different reason. But this is absolutely wonderful. In it, I thought you had a very interesting analysis. First of all, I mean, it says like, I mean, it's a critique from the left, and I wanted it, like, I mean, in that maybe that you share with us what precisely you think is left of the left after the COVID sequence, and yeah, that's what is do you offer that's a critique that require to call it a critique from the left in this book?
Right. Well, I have to give a very brief answer because in a few minutes I have to go and pick up my daughter from school. And I apologize, maybe because you've just opened up a huge can of worms. Yeah. And of course, we could stay here another hour just to talk about that. And if you guys want, I'd be happy to do that at some point. But very briefly, I mean, I'll just give my own experience. And I historically come from the left, what I would consider the socialist left. But at the same time, for a very long time, I've kind of been drifting apart from not just the mainstream left, but even the so-called radical and social left. The first contentious issue that I found myself at odds with the left on was the issue of the European Union and the euro. We know that most of the left in Europe, but not just the mainstream left, but even the radical left, at least from the 90s onwards, has been very much, in favor of this process of supranationalization that we've been talking about over the past hour. And to me, that seemed incomprehensible on a number of levels. And so, that already kind of caused me to start to drift away from the left, or if not to be cancelled by a lot of people on the left, and being accused of being some far right nationalists simply for speaking about the importance of national sovereignty from a popular democratic standpoint, and especially from a socialist standpoint. So when COVID broke, I was already sort of in a problematic phase of my relationship with the left, and COVID, simply turbocharged that. I think it really drove a huge wedge between me and the left, in a sense that not just me. I mean, I and a few other people on the left that criticize these measures, and the overwhelming majority of people on the left that, of course, embraced these measures, which we now know to have had devastating economic and social and psychological consequences for an incalculable number of people. But this was all very clear right from day one, in my opinion, and that's what we talk about in the book. A lot of the devastating consequences of these policies that are now becoming apparent, and that now people are feeling comfortable to speak about, were in fact easily predictable from the onset. In fact, were predicted by a large number of people, such as the signatories to the Great Barrington Declaration, just to give one example. So the fact that the left embraced these authoritarian, anti-scientific, anti-democratic policies, to me, was just mind-boggling, but that's what happened, and that's how I found myself making allies with a lot of people on the right during that period, because they were the only ones, or to a large extent, the ones criticizing these policies, and trying to understand why the left supported these policies is partly what brought Toby Green and I to write this book. So it first of all was a way to answer that question to ourselves. I'm not sure we fully answered that question, but I think we explore a lot of the in the book a lot of the reasons why the left embraced these policies, and I think I think it has to do with fundamentally with this sort of the anthropological change that has occurred within what we consider to be the left, and how the left has evolved from being a sort of vehicle of working class politics to being a vehicle of the PMC, the professional managerial class, of being a vehicle of the urbanite middle classes, and essentially being a vehicle of anti-democratic politics. The left has essentially become, the main ally of the economic establishment over the past 20 years, in a sense that it's the left that sets the parameters acceptable terms of the debate, and this is very powerful in excluding any voice that criticizes the establishment, because it allows you to very easily dismiss them as being fascist or racist or nationalist. And I think the left has played a crucial role in this sense as in really supporting the ruling classes, providing them with the right messaging, providing them with these with the right narrative, in order to keep the working classes in their place. And I think that's a lot of what we saw during COVID was kind of a deranged expression of this. It was a deranged expression of a lot of people on the left, fearing essentially the masses. I think a lot of it was a result of simply fear of the masses and blind trust in the establishment, blind trust in the institutions, blind trust in the experts, because the left understands that these people are with them kind of a bulwark against against the rabble, against the masses, against the populists. And I think a lot of what happened was a result of this. And of course, it's now massively backfiring, because a lot of people now, I think rightfully so, view the left and I'm not one of those that says, but that's fake left, and I'm part of the real left. Left is people identify as the left, and the people who themselves identify as being on the left. So the left is what everyone considers to be the left. I think a lot of people today understand that the left is an enemy, is an enemy of the working classes. I think the kind of right-wing populist backlash that we're witnessing now is very much a reaction of that, and also very much a reaction of the policies that the left supported during those horrendous years of the pandemic.
And we definitely need to have you over to talk more about the COVID.
Thomas, thank you so much.
The French invaders